Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Happy Memorial Day to all those who celebrate, and we shout out all the soldiers, whether you have served or not. We are thankful for your service. But today, on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, we have a great show ahead. We will be covering everything from ESPN's tight end rankings and the rookie rankings for the upcoming fantasy football season to the Group of 5 fantasy college football preview. And also, we're going to be looking at the big games in the NBA and NHL tonight as the Pacers face the Celtics and the Oilers face the Stars. But as always, I do ask before we begin that you do like and follow the show. Also, if you would like to leave a tip or a donation, please go to the link shown here at gsmc.cloud. All your support is a big help to the network. It helps me and my fellow podcasters, so it is greatly appreciated if you do decide to leave a tip or donation. Also, you can leave a question for me to be answered at the beginning of the next episode, so do please make yourself available to that link right there. Now, to start off the show, we are talking about the Pacers and the Celtics. Sorry about that. That should say Game 4 betting preview. But ultimately, this is going to be a very interesting game, as the big thing that I think about when I think about this series is the word luck. The Celtics obviously could right now be down 2-1 in this series, but they have been able to pull away, mainly due to Indiana's kind of ineptitude in the final stages of these games. But looking at the betting trends and also the fantasy projections for tonight's game, tonight we are looking at a 222.5 over-under. Also, Boston is giving Indiana 7.5 points. And the money lines are looking like Indiana plus 245 and Boston minus 300. Looking at fantasy projections, this is from DraftKings. Obviously, the big names to look out for, obviously, because Tyrese Halliburton is injured, we will not be looking at his projections for tonight, but we will be looking at Jason Tatum, a much discussed and controversial figure in both real life and the fantasy world. Tonight he is valued at $10K on DraftKings, and it's projected to have 55 flat DraftKings fantasy points. Like I said before, in terms of Indiana, Tyrese Halliburton, his status is up in the air, so tonight's big player for them, if he should be out, is Pascal Siakam. He is currently priced at 7.5K on the DraftKings market, and he is projected to have 40 fantasy points. That is going to be a huge miss if Tyrese Halliburton does not play, but I highly expect Pascal Siakam due to the fact that Boston does not have that much depth outside of the injured Kristaps Porzingis down low. They have tried to combat that with whether it be Luke Cornett or O'Shea Brissett down low, but ultimately Pascal Siakam has looked to be one of Indiana's most promising players in this series, both offensively and defensively. Another quick shout out in terms of fantasy, after his surprisingly huge last game in Game 3, Al Horford last game, obviously without his offensive production, perhaps the Celtics would not have been in the position they were in down late in that game. Tonight he is valued at 5.8K, so if you're looking for a very cheap option to roster on your DraftKings daily fantasy basketball lineup, he is one to look out for. He is currently projected to have 30.8 DraftKings fantasy points, so not bad for someone who was not expected to get as many looks in this series as he did. But overall, I think that Al Horford does add that offensive presence, at the very least for the Celtics, like he proved in Game 3 of this series. So I think that he could be a sneaky fantasy prospect for tonight's game. So do look out for him. And last but not least, in terms of fantasy, another guy who impressed in the absence of the Pacers' biggest star, Andrew Nembhard. Last game, he had a very impressive game, kept the pace for this Pacers offense. Tonight he is projected to go for 5.7K on the DraftKings market, and is last but not least projected to have 28.5 DraftKings fantasy points. So as you can see, high variations and shifts in terms of both betting trends and fantasy projections for tonight's game, due to the fact that even though the Celtics have a big 3-0 lead, this series has not been as expected in terms of how close all of these games have been, especially last game when a Tyrese Halliburton was injured. So I do believe that in order for the Pacers to keep pace, I do think that ultimately you have to rely on a guy like Andrew Nembhard to keep the pace for the squad. Also, looking at Pascal Siakam down low, that is the one advantage that I do think the Pacers have. They have that depth down low to combat anything that Boston throws at them, whether it be Siakam or Turner. They just have that extra oomph that is lacking right now in the Boston Celtics depth chart because of the injury to Porzingis. As for Porzingis' status for tonight's game, he was, in the words of Woj, expected to be in this lineup for tonight's game at the very least, but in my honest opinion, I do think that Porzingis should be held out, as it is looking more and more like Boston should be able to handle the Pacers in this final game of the series. I do expect Boston to win. Ultimately, I think that that game 2 nights ago was a fluke. I think that because the fact that Boston was able to come back in such a fashion, I do think that Indiana is going to come out deflated tonight, thinking that obviously they could have at least stolen a game and prevented the Celtics from going for a sweep, but that is not the case tonight. I think that the Celtics will complete the sweep in good old-fashioned dominance, showing that they do belong in the NBA Finals. But ultimately, I think that this series was a very entertaining series, both in terms of how to play this in terms of betting odds, and also in how you could roster a potential lineup for this squad. So looking ahead at the betting odds for tonight's game, I think that -7.5 for Boston is a nice round number for them. I think that ultimately they will cover this number. I think that this game should be easier than last game. I think that Boston is hungry. They're looking to close out this series, finally get a much desired sweep, and look ahead to the NBA Finals, where they can plan to have a healthy Kristaps Porzingis back. I also believe that in terms of the over-under for tonight's game, I think that it's going to hit the under. I do not think that Indiana's offense is going to be able to keep up with Boston in the slightest tonight, because of the fact that they're missing Tyrese Halliburton. I do expect Andrew Nembhard to have a huge game. I do expect Pascal Siakam to have a huge game. However, I do not think their efforts will be realized, as I just do not think they have enough around them to mitigate for the loss of Tyrese Halliburton. So therefore, I'm going to take the under in this game, and I do advise that you do the same. In terms of the money line, I do think that Boston money line is a bit high, also in terms of Indiana's money line. So I will stay away from the money lines tonight. I do think that overall this game is just going to be a straightforward game. I think that Boston is going to handle them comfortably, hence the under in terms of the spread there. But overall, looking at fantasy, I do think that there are some huge opportunities for big points. I'm looking at Jason Tatum tonight to be the huge fantasy point getter again. He has had a very good series this series. Last series, he was the only player to post a stat line like he did without any turnovers. So that is huge, both in real life and in terms of fantasy. And I think that he will be the player to get the Celtics going tonight. But I'm also looking at Al Horford. I think that the last game was a huge surprise for not only him, but for the Celtics as a whole. I think that his 7 3-pointers last game did help them in that comeback. So obviously, right now, he is going to be the most important player, both offensively and defensively, for the Celtics. Can he keep up with the Pacers bigs in this game? That's the big question. Obviously, we know that at any given time, his shot in the corner will always be open because the Pacers are going to be so focused on both Tatum and Brown. So I'm looking for a high volume of three-pointers from Ageless Al tonight because of the fact that Indiana is going to be trying so hard to keep up with Tatum and Brown tonight. Another player that's going to benefit from that is Drew Holiday, perhaps. Obviously, last game he had the big steal, a couple of steals in that game, but the big steal coming at the end of the game. I think that Drew Holiday has just been a huge impact player for the Celtics. In terms of fantasy, he's not someone who you would expect to put up huge points in fantasy, but he is always a reliable option, whether it be on your bench or as a utility option. I just think that overall, the Celtics players tonight will benefit in terms of fantasy rather than Indiana's, just because of the loss of Tyrese Halliburton and how he can affect that Indiana squad. But honestly, I do think that we have to be wary about that statement because of the fact that Nembhard did deliver for them last game. And I think that Siakam is going to benefit as well. I think that Turner as well. I'm also looking at TJ McConnell. He's a huge contributor in these games, whether it be distributing the ball, getting points on his own. So do look out for a lot of Indiana players on the market who I expect to, whether or not they get blown out, put up good numbers in terms of fantasy. But honestly, I'm looking at Boston's players to benefit in terms of fantasy as well. That's going to do it for this segment. But coming up in our next segment, we're going to move over to the NHL, to the ice, to talk about the Edmonton Oilers and the Dallas Stars Game 3 tonight.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into the second segment, as always, I do ask that you leave a tip and donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both the network, myself, and my fellow podcasters, so do please consider leaving a tip at the link. Now, coming up for our next segment, we have a game in the NHL tonight as the Edmonton Oilers take on the Dallas Stars and look to clinch home ice advantage over the Stars. They already split in Dallas, so Edmonton is looking to take a huge advantage in this series. After an exhilarating game last night, give credit to the Eastern Conference finalists, Florida and New York, in their exhilarating game. Edmonton and Dallas looking to top that tonight. I think that this series is the more even of both conferences. I do think that ultimately Edmonton and Dallas are very well balanced to face each other. I think that this is an exciting series in terms of storylines, as we've seen how the Edmonton special teams has come on strong to help them late in the playoffs, while Dallas is just very well structured in all levels of the ice, can hit you hard during any time of the game. And so I'm looking forward to tonight's game to see how this series shakes out, which team will have the balance shifted come tomorrow. And so looking at the early betting odds for this game, we have the over-under set at 5.5 points. In terms of the money line, Edmonton minus 130, Dallas plus 110. And the Oilers are favored. They're at minus 1.5 for tonight's game. Looking ahead at the fantasy in terms of DraftKings, as before, all three top spots are taken by Edmonton Oilers, with Draisaitl, McDavid, and Bouchard being the top three. But tonight, I just want to focus on Draisaitl and Bouchard. They are the keys, both on offense and defense, for the Oilers for tonight's game. I think that Leon Draisaitl is just a powerful player, and he can get going at any time, obviously leading not only the Oilers but the league in playoff points. So obviously he's going to be tonight's highest priced player at 8.5k, and he's projected to have 18.8 fantasy points for tonight. Looking at a player in Evan Bouchard who has been surprising, whether in terms of his defensive prowess or offensively, where he has been scoring booch bombs left and right. He is very loved in Edmonton, a key figure for Edmonton's playoff run this year. He is valued tonight at 6.8k. He is projected to have 14.9 fantasy points. In terms of the Stars, let's look at the Stars as a team. They obviously rely heavily on defense as well, and it all starts with the man in between the crease tonight, Jake Ottinger, probably the second best goalie in my mind in these playoffs behind Bobrovsky, maybe even the third best if you want to throw in Shesterkin in the Eastern Conference, but Jake Ottinger is still probably the most solid goalie in the Western Conference, and is a huge reason as to why Dallas are where they are. He is projected to have 8K. He's projected to go for 8K. Sorry about that. He's projected to have 13.4 fantasy points as well. And in terms of that defense, it all starts with a man who is averaging an insane amount of ice time, so vital to the Stars defensively and on special teams, Miro Heiskanen. He's only projected to go for 5.9K. I think that's a bargain for anyone looking for a strong defenseman to lead their squad tonight. And he's projected to have 11.5 fantasy points. Now, in terms of how this game will play out, it is really anyone's game, in my opinion. I think that both of these games, Game 1 and Game 2, beforehand, showed the fact that this is a very tight series, and it all could come down to who's the better defense. I think that this series, goals were very hard to come by. I think that, obviously, both teams don't want to make as many mistakes offensively, and that's why they are focusing on their defense. They are focusing on being strong in terms of penalty kill. Obviously, both teams very high up in terms of playoff penalty kill. So that is why, looking at these odds, I think the odds are right where they need to be. I think the over-under is fair. I think, honestly, this game could go either way, because both teams, while strong defensively, have those players that can get going on the offensive side of the ice. Edmonton, obviously, with that three-headed monster, Draisaitl, McDavid, and Bouchard, can get you from anywhere. Or, if you look at the Stars, they have a young gun in Wyatt Johnston. They have Jason Robertson. They have the structure built for them going forward on all levels of the ice. But in tonight's game, I am looking at the Oilers minus 1.5 as a very appealing option for bettors tonight, as I think that the Oilers will ultimately win this game. They stole home ice advantage from Dallas by splitting the first two games, and now they're heading back to Edmonton with 3 games to play there. So I think that Edmonton has a really strong chance to make a statement in this Western Conference Finals going forward. I think that Leon Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard are well-deserved in terms of where they are placed in terms of fantasy. They are the 2 top point scorers for Edmonton and in the playoffs, respectively. So I just think that Edmonton right now should be feeling pretty confident. Obviously, they are coming off that Game 2 loss where the Stars finally broke through in the third quarter, got some goals. But I'm looking at Edmonton to bounce back. I think that Edmonton has the better experience when it comes to how to manufacture points, both offensively and also I think they're going to really be honed in terms of special teams and in terms of their power play and penalty kill tonight. So therefore, I just think that Edmonton has just enough to eke out a win at home tonight. and really take over this series. But in terms of the Stars tonight, I think that the Stars will score a couple of goals because that's who they are. That's their identity. The Stars will never go down without a fight. Obviously, I'm looking for them to want to establish themselves defensively, but I also think that they, with their young guns up front, want to score goals as well. Obviously, I'm looking at Stuart Skinner in terms of Edmonton's goaltending issues to kind of have to weather a Star storm early on. But overall, I think that Stuart Skinner will have a bounce-back game. I think that he will do enough, mainly due to the defense in front of him. The amount of shots they do not give up is very crucial in how Edmonton plays. So I think that whether Stuart Skinner faces a lower number of shots or a higher number of shots is highly dependent on Edmonton, but ultimately I think that he will be able to deal with them and that Edmonton will provide for him up front as well. That being said, going forward, I think that the betting trends look for them to be a bit more volatile, and I think that since this series is going to be low solo scoring as we saw in the past couple of games, I do think that it will highly depend on how tonight's game goes as well. This game 3 is probably the most important game in this series, seeing as to how, since both teams split games at Dallas, this next 3 games are very crucial as to how bettors are going to view this game going forward, how you are going to see the odds change in favor of one team or another. So do be very wary of how you bet coming up, but for tonight's game, I'm highly confident in saying that Edmonton minus 1.5 is a nice looking bet, and 5.5 is a very fair level in terms of how the points will be distributed for tonight's game. But that is just going to do it for this segment. Coming up next, we are going to get into what fantasy is all about. Yes, we're going to be talking some football, specifically Group of 5 fantasy college football, and all the nice players that you might be overlooking come draft time for fantasy college football in the Group of 5. So we will be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like I said last segment, we have a nice segment coming up next as we will be looking at, yes, the Group of 5 in terms of fantasy college football. This is a conference, a group of conferences rather, that tends to get overlooked in my opinion in terms of fantasy college football. I think that there are a high level of very talented players, especially quarterbacks, looking at these group of conferences. So I'm very excited to talk to you about some fantasy advice moving forward in terms of how to draft within this conference, because I think that there are going to be a lot of steals in this conference. Let's start off in the Mountain West, where there is a lot of discussion about certain teams, especially one in Idaho, and that being Boise State, as they get Malachi Nelson, a former 5-star recruit who formerly backed up both Caleb Williams and Miller Moss from USC. He obviously saw that Miller Moss is looking to be the starter at USC, and so he decided to move. A very intriguing move, however, to Boise State. A very talented team that becomes with him at the helm. But I also return a running back, a very exciting running back. In my opinion, one of the top 5 in the country in Ashton Jonty. Last year, he had 1,347 yards on 220 carries. So he is going to be a very interesting player in terms of fantasy college football come the start of the season. Overall, I'm looking at Boise State as one of the top teams in the Mountain West as well. Do not sleep on any of their players. I'm very high on Malachi Nelson. I would like to see what he does in terms of moving from a huge program in terms of USC to more of a mid-major one in Boise State, so I'm looking forward to that. Another team to look out for are the Fresno State Bulldogs, a very exciting team on the up. They return Mikey Keene, a quarterback who has bounced around a little bit, was a starter at UCF, but last year, in his first year with Fresno State, he had 976 yards with a total of 24 touchdowns. He also returns a very stellar backfield with Malik Sherrod and Elijah Gilliam. So look for Fresno State to continue their run of form within the Mountain West. I like Mikey Keene. Maybe he's a very volatile quarterback, not necessarily putting up as big numbers as I would expect a non-mid-major program to put up. But ultimately, I think that he's a nice player to look at if you want a nice steal. Moving on to the Sun Belt, where there's a lot of change within the league's top team, that being the Coastal Carolina Chanticleers. Gone are the days of Grayson McCall, one of the best signal callers in that school's history, and now you have a QB competition between Ethan Vasco, a young sophomore, and an MSU transfer in Noah Kim. This is going to be a very interesting quarterback controversy, as both have some experience. Last year, Ethan Vasco, in some limited game action, had 778 yards, an impressive 7-to-1 touchdown and interception ratio, and 786 rushing yards as well, whereas Noah Kim, transferring in from Michigan State University, in some limited game action last year where he had an up and down season with some injuries thrown in, he had 571 total yards through the air, and he had a 3-to-0 touchdown to interception ratio. So overall, I would shy away from anyone concerned with Coastal Carolina. You're not going to get the production that a Grayson McCall provided from this Coastal Carolina team. But I just want to let you know that this quarterback competition could be very interesting. And as a whole, Coastal Carolina as a school has been able to provide for any quarterback that has come through its ranks in the past. Obviously, Grayson McCall was such success. But moving on to probably the most attractive conference, the most attractive player within that conference, Conference USA. And yes, I'm talking about Liberty's Caden Salter. What can we say about this kid, though it hasn't been said before? Just an incredible athlete. Let's just go over last year's stats. 32 total touchdowns, including 1,000 yards rushing for a quarterback. 12 touchdowns on the ground as well, showing off his dual threat ability. Last year, he was the third-ranked fantasy player, only behind Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix last year. So if you're looking for someone who wants to put up points in a hurry, Caden Salter is that mid-major quarterback that I'm most excited about if I were to draft a fantasy team and want a quarterback who's not viewed as highly as, say, power conference quarterback. So Caden Salter is the name to remember if you want a mid-major QB, if you're kind of panicking and you want a guy who has been solid in terms of mid-major production. Caden Salter is the guy. He returns a backfield with Quentin Cooley in it. Last year, he had 1,067 rushing yards and 10 TDs on the ground. So he's another option to kind of show how potent this Liberty offense is going to be this year. But overall, in terms of Conference USA, Liberty is the team to beat. I think that Caden Salter is just too much for the rest of the league. He's playing like he's a power conference QB, and ultimately he is the quarterback from that league that I am most excited about due to his dual threat abilities. But last but not least, perhaps a conference that is also looking to break into the CFP as well now that this 12-team playoff. That is the AAC. I think that both the Conference USA and AAC have teams within it that are looking to go above and beyond, break into the CFP 12-team playoff, and make a shock run going deep into that tournament. But let's look first at the AAC, last but not least, with the Memphis Tigers. The Memphis Tigers obviously Also another team that wants to break into that CFP 12-team playoff. They also have had a great couple of seasons over the years, and they return another stellar mid-major QB in Seth Hennigan. He's probably my QB2 in terms of a group of 5 behind Salter. I think that Seth Hennigan has just been a steady hand for the Memphis Tigers for the past couple of years. Last year had probably one of the better seasons for a mid-major quarterback with 3,880 yards, 35 total touchdowns, 274 yards rushing on the ground. So as you can see, Seth Hennigan rivaling Caden Salter in terms of production from last year. I think that he is going to be a huge steal for any team late in the fantasy draft. I also think that the Memphis Tigers have some interesting players in their backfield, and also in terms of their wide receiver core, they're returning 2 wide receivers who in my mind can be very interesting players in terms of fantasy. With Rock Taylor, he returns with 1,083 yards from last year, only 4 touchdowns though, so he has that level of production, but he still needs that touchdown total to rise. And also Demir Blankumsey, 901 yards last year, 7 total touchdowns. So overall, 2 solid receivers in terms of production. Obviously, one in terms of yards, the other in terms of TDs. But ultimately, the guy who I'm looking at from Memphis is Seth Hennigan. I think that Seth Hennigan, like I said before, is the second quarterback in terms of mid-majors who you should look out for in terms of fantasy. Last team that I want to highlight here, a team that hasn't necessarily been that solid all around, a couple up and down seasons, but a very exciting young quarterback who is returning. That is the University of South Florida, and that quarterback being Byram Brown last year, a very exciting dual threat quarterback. If you saw last year when they played Alabama, obviously the conditions in that game were dreadful, but you saw the spark that he can provide to the South Florida offense. Obviously, if the conditions were better, perhaps in that game you could have seen a huge upset last year from him. But moving on to his stats, most importantly, which excite me. 3,292 yards to the air, 809 rushing touchdowns for a total of 37 total touchdowns. So as you can see, he does have that sneaky good production. Obviously, if he's given the opportunity to grow and develop, who knows what that touchdown total will be for this year. He returned some exciting players in his own receiving core. In Sean Atkins, last year he had 1,054 total yards and 7 total touchdowns. Very exciting player. And Naeem Simmons returns. Not as much production with only 637 yards, but he had 5 total touchdowns. So looking at the AAC, those 2 teams, those couple of players are going to be very coveted if you want a mid-major player not going outside of the Power 5. I think that overview gives you a solid group of players that I think will have huge success come the start of the season. Obviously, the group of 5 as a whole wants to go to the CFP 12-team playoff, break into that tournament, and go far. So ultimately, I think these players are more desperate than ever to put up a huge number of stats, and your fantasy team should benefit from that. But that should just about do it for this fantasy college football preview in the group of 5. Coming up next, we'll be moving to the NFL, where I'll be looking at tight end rankings from ESPN, and then last but not least, I'll be looking at how they rank this year's exciting crop of rookies in my 5th segment. But we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back to GSMC's Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of the show, my final 2 segments, and they should be very exciting ones. We are going to shift from college football to the NFL, where I will be looking at ESPN's tight end fantasy rankings, we are in the home stretch of those rankings as well. We have done the quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. This is probably the last position group that I will get to. And in terms of these tight ends, this is a very exciting list, obviously. Tight ends, probably not the most coveted position in terms of fantasy, but still respectable. I have the list right here, and without further ado, let's get right into it. At number 1, a little bit of a shock, but not in my opinion, because as a rookie last year, he had big numbers in a Detroit Lions offense that was very successful, and yes, that is Sam Laporta who I'm talking about. Obviously, this, as well as Amon-Ra St. Brown's heightened rankings in the wide receiver rankings, is probably credited to Jared Goff's contract extension, but also just because of the monster athlete Sam Laporta is. I think that the Detroit Lions offense, especially going into next year, is going to be very varied. They retain Ben Johnson, their offensive coordinator, who is going to want to get as many players, as many touches as possible. So look for the Lions skill position players to benefit from that. I think that Sam Laporta, especially coming into a second year in the league, is going to be one of the premier tight ends in the league, obviously challenging the next guy on this list for the tight end 1 position at the end of the year. And I think that while a lot of people think that the next guy on this list is still the number 1 tight end in the league, I say that Sam Laporta is going to be the one to take over that come this next guy's retirement. And yes, that next guy, who I've been alluding to for quite some time, is Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce is still going to be one of the top tight ends in the league, no matter how long he plays. I think that ultimately this year, well, with the addition of a player to the draft and Xavier Worley for the Kansas City Chiefs, who we will discuss in my next segment, I think that Travis Kelce's numbers could go down, but he is still Mahomes' number 1 option. Obviously, you have a guy like Rashee Rice who's going to be relied upon this year, but outside of that, I think that the Chiefs were still going to try and solve their wide receiver issue. I think that Xavier Worthy's not just going to be a plug-and-play sort of player. He's going to want to be implemented more into Andy Reid's offense. So I think that ultimately Kelce is going to have his targets elevated at the start of this year. However, by the end of this year, I don't expect him to get as many targets, as I feel that Andy Reid is going to have integrated players like Worthy, Rice, MVS more into his system, get them more comfortable and acclimated to his style of play, and I think that Kelce's numbers will decline. That being said, I don't think they will decline as much as people expect. He is still Travis Kelce, and he still has Patrick Mahomes as his QB, and they are still one of the best wide QB tight end duos in the league. So I think that Travis Kelce, for the time being, has to remain in at least the top 2. Going on to number 3 here, is another player who is coming off a sad injury last year in the AFC Championship game. Who knows if he would have been able to help Lamar and the Ravens win in that AFC Championship game had he been healthy. Yes, I'm talking about Mark Andrews, one of the preeminent tight ends in this league for the past couple of years, mainly because of the Ravens' style of play, I suspect. I think that he is the number 1 target because of the fact that Lamar Jackson has not only himself as a rushing tool, but also a nice crop of running backs that has added Derrick Henry to it. So I think that Mark Andrews as a tight end benefits a lot from any times the Ravens pass because of his ability to play in the seam, in the slot. He's just a very versatile tight end who definitely deserves to be in the conversation for a top 3 tight end in the league. I do think he does sit behind Travis Kelce, also Laporta as well after his breakout rookie year, but obviously Mark Andrews, when healthy, is such a weapon for Lamar Jackson. That offense could be seen as not only the number 1 tight end in that offense, but as a receiver option, he is just that good and versatile for this team. And I think that ultimately Mark Andrews deserves to be a top 5 tight end in terms of fantasy. He's going to put up some big numbers this year for Lamar and the Ravens. Going in at number 4, kind of a surprise in my opinion, perhaps due to the fact that he gets a full season under Kyler Murray, but I'm not necessarily certain I would put him as high. It is Trey McBride. Last year, probably one of the better Cardinals weapons, seeing as to how they were heavily decimated by the injury to Kyler Murray to start the season, so their passing attack was not as potent as it should have been. But I can see how Trey McBride's status gets elevated due to the fact that Kyler Murray comes back. But however, I think that the Cardinals are going to want to get another rookie going, who I'm going to talk about later, for in this offense. So Trey McBride in the top 4 is kind of our first surprise here. That being said, I do think that the Cardinals will want to get their passing attack going, and he could benefit from that. But that is really all the stuff I want to say about him, rather, that should be of note. Coming in at number 5 is Evan Engram of the Jacksonville Jaguars. What a shocking turnaround for his career, moving from the Giants, where he did not have as much success, and now with Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Evan Engram having a huge success at the tight end position. However, I do think that his success stems from whether or not Trevor Lawrence can get going. I think that Trevor Lawrence is very volatile. I think this past year he definitely regressed to the mean a little bit. I do think that Evan Engram's play heavily relies upon how Trevor Lawrence plays, whether or not, he wants Evan Engram to be a huge part of this offense. I think he will be, because they lost Calvin Ridley. I think that Evan Engram now becomes one of the more potent targets in this team. However, I do think that Doug Peterson has wanted to rely on the run a little bit. So look for Evan Engram to be more seen in the screen action game a little bit. I think that it heavily depends upon whether or not Doug Peterson relies on Trevor Lawrence to be able to scheme around a player like Evan Engram. So I think that he is deserving of this spot, but we'll see as the season goes on whether or not Trevor Lawrence can keep him there. At the number 6 position is a tight end who can at any given time be in the conversation for any of the positions above him. That is George Kittle. Obviously, he is seen as a huge weapon for this 49ers offense. I think that George Kittle is going to be one of the top tight ends you talk about come the end of the year. I just think that he's one of those players who does not benefit from how good of skill position players are around him. I think that Brock Purdy wants to distribute the ball a lot, and that is why that number at number 6 is reflected with George Kittle. I think that he's still one of the preeminent tight ends in the league. He's still going to get major yard production. However, I do see with the rise of some younger players, how George Kittle can be viewed as outside the top 5. I think that he's still a stellar athlete, though, and we shouldn't count him out. Coming in at number 7, probably one of the more underrated tight ends on this list, in my opinion, mainly due to the fact that we don't know how he'll perform with his quarterback, Deshaun Watson, David Njoku. I think that David Njoku is a stellar athlete, but most of that stemmed from the fact that last year, once Deshaun Watson went down, he had inflated numbers due to the fact that Joe Flacco had him as his favorite target, and I think that Deshaun Watson coming back might limit his number of targets going forward, because Deshaun Watson is not necessarily that as reliant on tight ends as, say, Joe Flacco was. So I think that David Njoku, while deserving to be in these top 10 rankings, might have his numbers deflated due to the fact that Deshaun Watson is going to be looking more to players such as Elijah Mitchell, who is one of his more reliable targets, and Amari Cooper. That being said, I think that David Njoku could turn out to be a steal if Deshaun Watson incorporates him more into the offense, if Kevin Stefanski as well incorporates him more into their offense, because of the fact that David Njoku is such a stellar athlete. Very versatile in terms of his route running abilities, one of the best route running tight ends in the league in my opinion, and so I think he's well deserved to be on this list. Coming in at number 8, a very interesting player, another second-year player for Buffalo, Dalton Kincaid. I think that this number is elevated mainly due to the fact that he is now one of Josh Allen's premier targets. Obviously, they lost Gabe Davis, they lost Stephon Diggs. So who is going to be that number 1 target for the Buffalo Bills? I think the answer is going to be Dalton Kincaid, and that is reflected in why he's so high in these rankings. I think that Josh Allen's going to have to look for him early and often. I don't think he's as versatile as a route runner as some of the ones above him, but he is still a very nice piece. Obviously, coming out of Utah last year, one of the best tight ends in college football history, in my opinion. So I think that the pressure's going to be on him to be the guy for Josh Allen, but I think that he will handle that pressure well because of the fact that he is going to get a lot of targets in this offensive system, obviously, as they transition to more rushing style attack, as we saw last year. I think that Dalton Kincaid will get a number of short yardage opportunities, and thus I think that he is well deserving of a top 10 spot. At number 9, I think this is a guy who can be higher come the end of the year due to the fact that he now has better quarterback play, and that is Kyle Pitts. I think that Kyle Pitts has been heavily underrated due to the fact that his QBs over the past couple of years were dreadful. Now he gets an experienced QB in Kirk Cousins, who I think will utilize him very well. He gets a new head coach in Raheem Morris, who, while more defensive-minded, is more willing to utilize his offensive weapons and be able to get Kyle Pitts a number of targets in the future. So look for Kyle Pitts to be a player who rises in these fantasy rankings come the end of the year because of the fact that his quarterback is much better than he had in the past. And rounding out ESPN's tight end rankings, another player who kind of rose through the ranks sneakily last year, and his numbers are reflected this year, is Jake Ferguson. I think that Jake Ferguson definitely deserves to be in the top 10 just for his breakout campaign last year. I think that ultimately with the number of Cowboys who are ranked very highly in ESPN's rankings at other position groups, I think that reflects on Jake Ferguson, as he will not be ranked this highly, but he's still a sneaky good weapon for the Dallas Cowboys going forward. Dak Prescott loved him a lot in the red zone last year, so look for Jake Ferguson to have a big year again in terms of touchdowns, in terms of production in the red zone. I think that he could be a very nice steal for anyone drafting later in fantasy. But that'll just about do it for this segment of the show. Coming up on my last segment of the show, we transition from tight ends to this exciting group of rookies coming into the league this year. We will be right back for what should be a very exciting segment. Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. We are at the final segment of today, and that segment, like I said before, we have done the tight ends for ESPN's fantasy rankings, and now we are looking at the rookies. This is one of the most exciting group of rookies we have ever seen come into the league. and it's highly reflected in this rankings. I'm kind of shocked at some of the names on this list being as high as they are, but that should be attributed to the amount of parity in terms of skill positions in this particular group. So let's get right on to it. At number 1, obviously the son of a Hall of Famer has to be at number 1. So yes, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. going into a Cardinals team that was looking for that number 1 wideout, as I kind of hinted at before. I think that Marvin Harrison Jr., while he hasn't been getting as much hype as some of the receivers going into the draft, I think that he is the best receiver, just being that weapon for Ohio State that Kyle McCord needed last year to get acclimated to the level of Big Ten football. Just being that reliable target for Kyler Murray come the start of the season. I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. is just going to be one of the better rookie tight ends, wideouts in this league for years to come. And so I think that this well-deserved. I think that he needs the hype that he has deserved in the past, being one of the best receivers coming out of college that the NFL has seen in quite some time. And so I think that number 1 ranking in ESPN's rookie rankings is well-deserved. Look for him to be a huge player in the league for years to come. And number 2, I think this is highly reflected on the fact that his quarterback has not had a player of his caliber in his wide receiver core in quite some time, and that is Malik Neighbors. He immediately becomes the number 1 wideout for Daniel Jones. I think that this is more a reflection on the fact that the Giants expect a lot more out of Daniel Jones rather than is on Malik Neighbors, because obviously coming into this, Neighbors is going to be the number 1 wideout in terms of targets for ESPN. That does not mean that Daniel Jones' production immediately is reflected by that. I think that this ranking is mainly due to the fact that Malik Neighbors will suddenly become a number 1 wideout in the system, and that is why ESPN ranks him so highly. That being said, I think that he is one of the more less coveted players in terms of the wide receiver class, in terms of that high end of that receiver class especially. And so I feel as if this might be a too high a ranking for a player whose quarterback has too many questions, whose other wide receiver core members have a lot of questions surrounding them. There's a lot of pressure to put on a young player like Malik Neighbors, but I'm looking for him to have a nice season. He could turn out to be a steal in my opinion, but I would be wary of drafting him as high as he should, as ESPN thinks he should be drafted, just because of the fact that that's a lot of pressure to put on a rookie wideout. Coming in at number 3, probably the guy in the best situation for any rookie, Rome Odunze. I think that Rome Odunze coming in with Caleb as his new quarterback for the Chicago Bears, coming in, expectations will be off him, whereas in terms of Malik Neighbors, more expectations and more spotlights will be on him as well. I think that Rome Odunze will benefit from that. In terms of traits, I think that he is one of the best in the class. I think that his body control is incredible, his contested catch abilities are incredible, and look for Caleb Williams to want to throw the ball early and often to him. I think that the pressure is off him. I think the pressure is more on Caleb Williams and the pieces that the Chicago Bears added around him rather than Rome Odunze himself. So I think that he could be a steal from fantasy draft time, mainly based on the fact that Caleb Williams wants to have that rookie-on-rookie connection to get himself acclimated to the league. I just think that the Chicago Bears as a whole is a very exciting offense to look at, and I think that Rome Odunze could be one of the benefactors of that. Coming in at number 4, I think this guy is rated too highly. I love him as a Texas fan, but coming off an injury, I don't think he should be as high as this, and that is Jonathan Brooks for the Carolina Panthers. Now, obviously, moving from a place where he was highly coveted to a team that needs more offensive oomph all around, I think that Jonathan Brooks' production will level off a little bit, and especially since he's coming off such a kind of harrowing injury as an ACL injury, I just think that Jonathan Brooks is going to be viewed as someone who might come on later in the year, but in terms of earlier on in the year, I do not expect Jonathan Brooks to have that level of production. Obviously, the Carolina Panthers are going to want to be careful with him, transitioning him from college to the NFL. Obviously, this past season for Jonathan Brooks was a breakout season for him as well, so who knows if he gets transitioned to the NFL as quickly as possible, got that injury, if he is acclimated to the amount of hits that he's going to face as a player for the Carolina Panthers, especially due to the fact that they don't have that system that they have down in Texas where he was better protected. So overall, I just think that Jonathan Brooks, a little bit too high in my opinion. At number 5, one of the more wild card type players on this list, and Brock Bowers for the Las Vegas Raiders. Obviously, Brock Bowers is such a versatile player. Like, how can we describe a tight end like Brock Bowers? Just incredible power, incredible athlete, all around, just an incredible player to have. But the fact that he is on the Raiders gives me pause, seeing as to how I don't think Antonio Pierce wants to focus on the passing attack as much. I think that they view Brock Bowers more as a utility player, a more gadget-style player for their system. Obviously, they're not focused on getting good production out of their quarterbacks, so I view Brock Bowers' yardage to come from more kind of like trick plays, gadget plays. But ultimately, I think he's going to be an interesting athlete to look at. I think that he could prove to be a steal, but let's just see how his game translates to the NFL, seeing as to how Georgia used him and how Las Vegas will use him. Coming in at number 6, I think this guy could prove to be higher due to the fact that his status in this wide receiver room is elevated due to the fact that there are some high caliber players leading this wide receiver core, and that is Brian Thomas. I think that Brian Thomas' status will get elevated mainly due to the fact that he's now the either number 1 or number 2 wideout for the Jacksonville Jaguars moving forward. I think that he certainly could be higher than Neighbors come the end of the year, but ultimately I think that Brian Thomas, viewed as one of the more less coveted players in the upper echelon of wide receivers in this class. However, I do think that Brian Thomas, for some points of the draft process, was viewed as the number 1 wire in this class, and I think he goes to a team that certainly benefits from having him, as they lost Calvin Ridley. I think that Doug Peterson will certainly want to incorporate him. Trevor Lawrence is certainly welcoming his presence on the squad. So ultimately, I think his stats will be inflated come the end of the year, mainly just the fact that he can be seen as the number 2 wideout on the Jags, and he could be seen as a wide receiver 5, at least in terms of the rookie class, in my opinion. Coming in at number 7, probably the most electric and exciting player in this draft class, going into the Kansas City Chiefs, Xavier Worthy. I think that Xavier Worthy is probably one of the more underrated wide receivers in this class, mainly due to the fact that players with his amount of speed mainly don't translate to the NFL. But if there's any team that can immediately incorporate him into their system, it is the Kansas City Chiefs. They're looking at Xavier Worthy as the next Tyreek Hill. Obviously, his speed is one thing, but his catching ability is one thing. He limited his amount of drops last year for Texas, and I think that he will transition to the NFL very efficiently because of the system that he's in. Look for him to be involved in every facet of the offense, whether as a gadget player in the slot, on the outside. He's a very exciting athlete, mainly due to his one trait above all else, and that is speed. I think that Xavier Worthy, come the end of the year, could be looking at the wide receiver 3 position in this rookie class. I think he's going to be a steal for anyone. I think he's the most exciting player in this draft class. I think coming in at number 8, one of the more underrated players in this draft class, in Legette, Xavier Legette. I think that Xavier Legette, coming out of college, is highly underrated. Obviously, moving to a team in the Carolina Panthers, I believe, that would highly covet his presence. I think that Xavier Legette as a whole is going to be one of those receivers that is more appreciated for his more developed traits in more areas than, say, like a Xavier Worthy, who's only attributed to speed. I think he's very valuable, and I think that I think he's very underrated at the number 8 position. Could be seen as wide receiver 6 in my opinion. And rounding out the rookie rankings, the 2 top quarterbacks taken 1 and 2 respectively, Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels. I think that obviously wide receivers in this draft class are more coveted, and that's reflected. But these QBs I expect to put up a lot of points, especially Caleb Williams in that new look Bears offense with that position group. Jaden Daniels as well. Don't rule out the Washington Commanders. I think that Jaden Daniels has a very nice setup for him as well, with a lot of interesting pieces around him. So these 2 young rookie quarterbacks will look to get off the mark. But that is going to do it for today's edition of GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It supports us a lot. It means a lot to our network and to me and my fellow podcasters. Leave a tip and donation at the link gsmc.cloud. But that is it. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Memorial Day to all. And that should just about end the show.